Okay, so I'm going to make a video, some Canadian military history, and we're going to be talking about the Korean War. So we're going to be talking about the Korean War in terms of its impact on Canadian defense policy. So essentially during this paper, I'm going to argue that Korea showed the difficulty, during Korea, Canadians had to figure out, one, how to find a role for a middle power, their new status, right? Because we all know Canada adopted a new status. And two, how to create operationally relevant standing forces. And some of the books I'm going to use, I'm just going to check off the list as I go down. Dennis Stairs' book, The Diplomacy of Constraint. Very unheroic title. Then a much more heroic title, which is David Berkeson's Blood on the Hills. And we're also going to talk about, of course, H.F. Wood's book, Strange Battleground. And we'll also talk about William Johnston's book, War Patrols. That's only 4 sources. However, they're all books. So during the comp, I might also mention Empire to Empire by, of course, Hilmer and Granatstein. And actually, Canada's Army. I'll mention Canada's Army because Granatstein actually has a pretty good analysis in there. So we'll talk about that. Okay, and so for the format, I'm just going to go over some dates and stuff for this video. See if I can remember them. I'll have to fact check them after. And then I'll go through my arguments. So let's begin with a bit of timeline and a bit of, timeline and a map. So, this is my very rough bit of the Korean Peninsula. I'm very sorry to the people of Korea. You have a wonderful country, and I've had the great opportunity to serve with both people, Canadians of Korean descent, and with serving Korean Army officers, and they're all wonderful, so I'm sorry about that. Anyway, so Korean War, just some key dates. It starts in June of 1950. In June of 1950, the North Korean People's Army does that. It pushes down the ROKA, Republic of Korea Army. It pushes them down to the Pusan perimeter, and boom. That happens in June of 1950. Then in September, starting in September through October, there is a counteroffensive, of course, the Incheon landings by Douglas MacArthur, and I'm not going to go into the detailed tactical thing, but we know that they go whoop, and they go right up to the border, right? Around September, October, the Chinese basically warn the Americans not to do that. MacArthur says, what's the worst you could do? And to which Mao says, I'll show you. And they push to the south. They recapture Seoul again. And then starting around... I'm going to have a YouTube bubble here. It is in January of 1951, I believe, that the UN counteroffensive begins again. And it stabilizes by July 1951. We're in a stalemate. In terms of Canadian dates, we are looking at the first deployment of 2 Patricia, and they arrive in December of 1950. The rest of the brigade, then we have Cap Young in April. The next month we have 25 CAB. So the whole brigade's on the ground by May. We have the 1 Commonwealth Division that's set up in July. This is 1951. And then we have 2 rotations. We have the 1st Battalions, they take over in May of 1951. And then in May of 51, then I think it's April 52. The 3rd Battalions take over. And in terms of a conclusion, the conclusion happens in July of 53. And actually, there's one rotation I'm not describing. It's the spring 1953 rotation, and I'm going to follow up here with a bubble or a comment because I studied, and it's only occurring to me now that I'm missing it. Anyway, so that's the map. Those are the dates we know that we have this visual map here. And that's all I need for the map, so thank you. A hand for our lovely assistant. She'll be back when we give out the vacation to Paraguay. So so let's go down and talk about the importance of finding a role. So for this, I'm going to talk about Dennis Stairs. I'll use Jack Granstein's book, Canada's Army, as well. And since I have it, I'll just hold it up because that's what YouTubers do. So there you have it. Okay, so let's talk about finding a role. So Second World War ends, right? By the time the Second World War ends, actually, to use a phrase from Empire to Empire, Canada basically goes into the American orbit in order to be able to better support Britain. But by 1945, Britain is kind of, May 1945, it's pretty clear that Britain is not going to be Canada's security ticket. That'll be the United States. And in fact, the first post-war chief of the General Staff, a guy named Charles Folks, who, if you're looking for a good account of that, you should really pick up Doug Delaney's book, Corps Commanders. What does he call Charles Folks in Corps Commanders? We're getting off topic, but that's all right. The Master Bureaucrat. The Master Bureaucrat takes over. And he immediately starts actually trying to reorient the Canadian Army to be more of an American oriented army, because if we're going to get military supplies and military integration, working just across the border actually makes much more sense than working across the ocean, especially when Britain is broke. Now, he wasn't successful. So what he'd actually tried to do is actually get rid of excess Canadian Army stock, and this is telling. He's like, I want to get rid of all this old British stuff so we can buy new American stuff, so the next war we're not going to be using this outdated British stuff. They didn't. So, they want to get rid of that stock. They don't. War comes, right? It comes in June. Now, June of 1950. When that happens, by that point, the Canadians are actually, they're really banking so that we'd become the kind of guiding idea for Canadian diplomacy at the time was functionalism. And functionalism is basically, we're going to operate in an area where functionalism, actually, how was it put? The functionalist idea is that a middle power or a smaller power can act like a great power in areas of its own concern. So in terms of Canada, like economically, especially in 1945, everything else was kind of blown up. We can act like great power. One area where we try to capitalize that's in the United Nations. It's part of our United Nations, NATO. We're trying to leverage these collective security organizations to further our interests. So, in Diplomacy of Constraint, Dennis Darrows kind of catalogs how Canadian diplomats are trying to make participation in the war contingent on kind of dialing back the U.S. intervention. So, for example, like the UN intervenes, right? It's a UN Security Council resolution that happens that allows a response, an armed response under the UN flag in Korea. However, it only goes through because the Russians have walked out in protest. The Americans slipped the vote through. It's a very well-told story. What the Canadians are actually really concerned about is that they're actually trying to constrain the Americans, right? Because they're worried that the Americans are going to try to roll Korea into kind of a regional policy of rollback, if actual rollback, and kind of engaging, the Americans are trying to tie them to a bunch of other anti-communist struggles in Southeast Asia, whereas Canada is very much trying to decouple it, to have it, Korea be an independent example of collective security, where we're using kind of the authority of the UN vice kind of the authority of force. However, to do that, we quickly find that we initially try sending, I think, 3 destroyers, and the Americans say, oh well, it's token, and it's kind of, no, it's not a token, it's 3 destroyers, and to which Dean actually says, of course, 3 tokens then. So Dennis Darrows kind of sets up the idea that Canadian participation in the war was actually very much part of Canadian strategy of reinforcing collective security organizations, or constraining the Americans in order to reinforce the legitimacy of collective security organizations. In terms of the Army, to be able to support that, it's an open question, because the Army's really not designed for that. By that point, the Army is basically a brigade group, roughly, kind of spread across the country, still based off mobilization. Folks that try to kind of integrate it more with the Americans. Our only real standing commitment at this point is the Mobile Striking Force up north, which was, in theory, an air portable / airborne brigade group that could reinforce and prevent a Soviet lodgment in the north. And he actually gives a few options, right? He actually, at one point, it's like, we can send Canadian forces either as a brigade or as a regimental combat team, right? Like with American equipment. At one point, I think one of the options, he says, maybe we are a regimental combat team that serves under American command, which would be, an RCT that falls under British command, which would be messy. Would have been messy. The other thing to keep in mind is that as they're setting up these forces, what will become 25 Canadian Infantry Brigade Group or 25 CIB for Korea, they're also standing up 27 CIB for Europe, because there is a real concern that Korea over here, if I'm Canada and we've got Korea over here, right? That's only a feint so that the Soviets can come and whack through Europe, right? So at the time, we're also standing up 27 CIB for potential deployment to Europe, and with the formation of Supreme Allied Commander Europe SACEUR in 1951, that happens. So in terms of finding operationally relevant forces, they have no real mobilization base. Like, there's no, the switches either on or off, there's no dimmer switch for the Canadian forces right now. So what do? They basically set up a special force, which is actually somewhat similar to what they did for the South African War. And so the whole idea is you go out across the country and you find, they found John Rockingham, who's a brigadier from the Second World War, who'd done some militia time in between, and they say, okay, do you want to lead a brigade? He says yes. They're going to stand up also third battalions, not a formed brigade, but each regiment, the RCRs, the Vandus, the Patricias, are going to set up second and third brigade, second and third battalions. The second battalions are going to be the special force for Korea, and the third battalions are originally designed as just replacement battalions for those battalions, right? Because they're expecting high casualties. Those second battalions, get stood up under John Rockingham. And there they are using that old British equipment, right? And David Berkison would argue that in Blood on the Hills that we were caught unprepared and that the army hadn't developed sufficient doctrine in the meantime. It didn't have an independent doctrine, an independent way of doing things. I mean, at a battalion level, battalion's a battalion. Whether we needed a Canadian flavor on it or not is pretty debatable. He does argue, though, that the equipment is inadequate. And he makes a big case throughout his book that Canadians suffered from outdated equipment, and we would have been better served by having American equipment. William Johnson actually disagrees with them, and he says the problems the Canadians encountered in Korea had less to do with equipment. There were actually very few equipment complaints, and more to do with leadership. But we'll get to that later. So the first, one interesting thing about that first brigade group that gets sent, because it's 25 CAB throughout. However, it's basically 3 different brigade groups, right? You have the first brigade group made of the 2nd Battalions that serves from May to May. So May 51 to May 50 to May 51. No. Yeah, okay, that actually arrives in Korea. Sorry. That arrives in Korea between May of 1950 and May of 1951. You have another rotation of the 1st Battalions from May of 1951 to April of 1952, and then you have the 3rd Battalions that go from April, May of 1952 to May of 1953. Those are the 3 that we're going to roughly talk about. So that 1st Brigade group, they actually train in Fort Lewis, Washington, because there aren't facilities in Canada. They're all old war facilities. It's all kind of broken. I mean, they're only really stood up in the winter. They only really start training and getting ready in the winter. Now, during that time, it's decided to send 2 PPCLI basically onto Korea under a guy named Jim Stone, first, because they were just going to be, I mean, that's the time when MacArthur was punching out the peninsula. They thought, it was thought at the time, basically, hey, we'll let you just, we just want to be part of this, right? And we're going to basically be policing, right? That doesn't happen. They actually end up getting thrown in the line in April. Then by the time they show up, there's enough pressure that when they show up in no, they show up before then. I think they show up in I have to, for the first time ever, I'm gonna okay, they show up in December 1950. Excuse me. They show up in December 1950 for the first ever time I checked my notes. So, December 1950, at that point, it's kind of, it's during the Chinese counter attack, right? So MacArthur's first push up post Incheon is when they're sent. By the time they arrive in December 1950, the Chinese have been advancing. There's pressure to throw the Patricias into the line. Jim Stone says no, because his troops are basically untrained. Now, for that 1st Brigade group, the officers had all been pretty much handpicked with basically whoever off the street, and there's the mobilization had been hasty, and of course they cut back paperwork, meaning that a lot of people who shouldn't have got in. And it kind of demonstrated very early on the problems with of not having a real mobilization plan and not having that sort of dimmer switch plan, right? Anyway, Jim Stone actually really needs to whip his guys into shape. They have a high level of replacements or high level of rejects once they get in theater, because they're actually going to be fighting, as it turns out. He trains the guys hard a lot. A lot of them get sent home because they're medically defective or mentally defective, just morally defective. But they do well. They actually do quite well. They do well at Cap Young in April, where they get first recommended for the U.S. Presidential Unit Citation in the defense of Cap Young, which is great to read about, which I'm not going to talk about because I'm already 20 minutes in. The rest of the brigade shows up in April starts showing up on the ground in May, when the line has started to stabilize. I believe it stabilizes by the summer, and they get into a very aggressive patrolling routine. So this is where you can talk about William Johnson's book, that at this time Rocky's brigade develops a habit of being really aggressive in its patrolling, dominating no man's land, and so on and so forth. This is while armistice negotiations are going on. The 1st Battalions are then deployed in May of 1951. Now, William Johnson in war patrols is very hard on the 1st Battalion deployments under a guy named Bogert, Brigadier John Bogert. I'll write that down. Maybe have a YouTube bubble at the end. They're not as aggressive. They kind of fall back on positions. They actually, he talks about 1 RCR getting bumped at Hill 355. A whole bunch of prisoners were taken. He's saying it's because basically the professionals, they weren't in the army to fight, unlike the 2nd Battalion guys. They hadn't done as extensive training. And it kind of shows that the professionals, they were just kind of barrack room soldiers, and that there's something to be said for that militia soldier mindset. Now, I disagree with Johnson for a few reasons. I think, one, patrols that he ends up praising are extremely risky. And at the time, 2 RCR, the 2nd Battalion, so the 1st Brigade group, they'd had a very high rate of casualties and replacements. And they were being told specifically to avoid that. Second, negotiations are ongoing. So the political incentive for risking troops is somewhat lower. Also, frankly, they just really hadn't done a lot of training. So during that winter, those 1st Battalions had also been tasked to help gear up 27 CIB that was going to Europe, right? And they didn't have a lot of warning. They didn't have access to Fort Lewis and Washington like the 2nd Battalions did. They didn't have a lot of their best officers had actually been handpicked to go with the 2nd Battalions, which really makes you think about, oh, well, the militia were so much better. Well, yeah, but they had a lot of the best officers from, especially staff officers from the regular force. So it kind of shows, by raising that special force and then deciding to rotate units, right? Because the special force was going to be raised, and they were just going to be individual replacements from the 3rd Battalion. But when they decide to deploy the 1st Battalions, it kind of messes with the whole thing. They're trying to figure out how you do it, like unit rotations, these kind of like small words. They're struggling, and it shows, right? You could argue, and as Johnson does, that they weren't as well prepared as the 2nd Battalions. I think his sort of moral argument, I think it's a bit of a Coldenham fallacy. You then get the 3rd Battalions that show up in May of 1952, and again they do better than the 1st Battalions, but they'd also been training. They'd been training specifically for that. For a good chunk of time. So I'm not. It kind of shows that the need, the problems you have with the size of army that Canada has, of trying to adjust to different commitments. 1 RCR fell at a time, or not 1 RCR, the 2nd rotation, Bogert's brigade, as it were, falls at a time when the army's trying to do a lot at the same time. The 3rd Battalion's had another year to kind of shake out, and that's Allard's group. In fact, Harry Pope, who basically set up a patrol school for the 3rd Battalions, sort of notes that as well. He's harsh on commanders, so he's very hard on commanders for not fully getting it. He did not like his time under the commander of one Vandu. However, he does note that there had been wider pressures that contributed to the lack of or lower patrolling activity in Bogart's brigade. Yeah, so that's about it. That's a fairly good summary. It's a bit disjointed. It's pretty late. However, it does bring it back to those 2 points, right? The difficulty of finding a role, because we didn't have a firm idea of how we're going to use our military to support like a UN operation. Like, no one had really seen Korea. No one had really decided, like, we're still trying to find a military role for ourselves. Korea does hit. When Korea hits, we don't quite know what to do with it. We raise that special force using that old equipment that boy, folks didn't really want to use. Now there's different disagreements as to, like, whether it's Burkeson or it's Johnston about whether that equipment had a major factor, a major impact on operations. In terms of actually standing up operationally relevant forces, because they're trying to do it all at the same time. So in Strange Battleground, H.F. Wood talks about we're doing everything for the first time. That's sort of his message throughout. It's the first time Canada had raised a force for the UN. It's the first time we'd participated in a war of kind of this scale, like in peacetime, and so on and so forth. That's ink. It shows further problems of trying to build operationally relevant forces, a country that can try to build operationally relevant forces in the circumstance of the early Cold War. Yeah, so I think that does it effectively. She's not here, but I want to thank my my honorary Vanna White for giving me a hand, and hopefully this hasn't been too disjointed for you. It'll make sense in my head, so that's all that matters. Thanks.